You are listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96, and we just heard from the sequence that was Angie Stone's hip hop group, and they were that song was sampled by Bruno Mars. Bruno Mars, a very controversial young man. He is genetically, he's all over the place. Some people don't like him. There were many debates in the Bernie Spear about Bruno Mars, and I come down on the side of the people. I am a fan of Bruno Mars. I think he's a good artist, and despite his, I guess because he wasn't born in the Congo, some people don't think he's black enough, but Bruno has my support, and we're getting ready to pay tribute to a young woman by the name of Vicki Garvin. Vicki Garvin was born Vicki Holmes in Richmond of Virginia, and Vicki Garvin spent time in China. She spent time in Ghana. She spent time in Nigeria. She worked with Malika El Shabazz. She worked with Robert Franklin Williams. And she knew Malcolm X. She met Malcolm X when Malcolm was a bartender, in the 40s or 40s. And she later hooked up with Malcolm in Ghana because she was living in Ghana. There was a group of expatriates, I guess, expatriates from the United States. Among them was Maya Angelou, having another senior moment. Maya Angelou and Vicki Garvin, Alice Wyndham, Percy. Mayfield, what's the brother's name? An author his name was Mayfield. He spent a lot of time in Guyana. But anyway, she hooked back up with Malika El Shabazz when he came to Ghana in 1964 and took him around, introduced him to, the people from the Algerians and the ambassadors from China, and had dinners with him and so on and so forth. But we're going to listen to the story of our sister, Vicki Garvin.
Hey y'all, I'm Erin Haynes. I'm the editor-at-large for the 19th News, a nonprofit newsroom reporting on gender, politics, and policy. I'm also the host of a brand new weekly podcast from the 19th News and Wonder Media Network called The Amendment. Each week, we're bringing you a conversation about gender, politics, and the unfinished work of American democracy. Our very first episode features my dear friend and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Nikole Hannah-Jones. It's out now, so please go listen and follow the show. On top of all of this, I'm your guest host for this month of Womanica. This Black History Month, we're talking about revolutionaries, the Black women who led struggles for liberation from violent governments, colonial rulers, and enslavers. These women had the courage to imagine radically different worlds, and they used their power to try and pull those worlds into view. Today, we're talking about a prominent activist who worked at the intersection of civil rights and labor organizing. She paved the way for a radical reimagining of racial politics and drew attention to the plight of Black women in America and abroad. Let's talk about Vicki Garvin. Vicki was born Victoria Holmes in Richmond, Virginia in 1915. Vicki's family, like many other Black families at the time, moved north to Harlem during the Great Depression. Her mother was a domestic worker for upper-class white families. Her father was a plasterer who, due to racism in construction unions, was often out of work. Vicki saw firsthand the kinds of injustice that her parents experienced in the workplace. She and her family often found themselves forced to move apartments on short notice. leaving in the middle of the night to escape eviction. Vicki already had the activist spirit in her by the time she graduated from high school and majored in political science at Hunter College. In her teens, she got involved with her church's youth program, a group led by future leftist Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. She continued her activism there after graduation, attending her first picket line during the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work protest in Harlem, which Powell organized. As an adult, Vicki was on the front lines at protests for Black civil rights and labor rights. She was a switchboard operator at the American League for Peace and Democracy, as well as a member of its corresponding union, the Professional Workers of America. There, she saw the power of workplace organizing. In 1940, Vicki moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, where she studied economics at Smith College. She became interested in Marxist theory and the way that race and class struggles intertwine. When she graduated, she became the first African-American woman to earn a master's degree in economics from Smith College. During the early 1940s, Vicki also became friends with a young Malcolm X, who was working as a bartender in Harlem at the time. She encouraged Malcolm to be politically active and invited him to lectures. Those conversations sparked a lifelong friendship between the two activists, who spent time exchanging ideas about revolution and political economy. Vicki was also a founding board member of the newspaper Freedom, which focused on the plights of African Americans, particularly Black women, and challenged America's conception of itself as a democracy. Inspired by her studies, writing, and conversations with other activists, Vicki joined the Communist Party in 1947. As her reputation and popularity grew, she helped found the National Negro Labor Council, or the NNLC. In fact, she helped organize the first NNLC convention in 1951, which hosted around 1,000 delegates. Vicki was a defiant voice of the Black left, though, during the Cold War, she found little sympathy from mainstream politics or from her own politics and labor affiliations. In the late 1940s, she openly criticized her union for not militantly supporting the rights of Black workers, calling upon the organization to do better. In 1953, at the height of anti-communist McCarthyism, Vicki was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. By the early 60s, Vicki had resigned from the Communist Party and found fewer and fewer opportunities for her in the United States. But she certainly wasn't ready to stop working. Vicki turned her attention abroad. She began traveling all over, observing how the political and social issues she witnessed on American soil manifested internationally. Her first stop was Nigeria, where she started focusing her work on anti-colonialism. After 2 years in Lagos, she intended to return to America, but a fateful stopover changed her plans. In 1957, Ghana had gained its independence from Great Britain. Its leader, Kwame Nkrumah, was a militant Pan-Africanist. By the 1960s, Ghana had attracted an expanding group of Black American intellectuals, and soon, Vicki was among its ranks. She roomed with Maya Angelou, and later lived next door to W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1964, Vicki's old friend Malcolm came to Ghana for a visit. Vicki guided him around, mentoring him and helping him build relationships with radicals outside of America who came from places like Algeria, Cuba, and China. Malcolm's tour of Africa was absolutely critical to the evolution of his political views. Vicki also spent some time in China, editing an English newspaper in Beijing and teaching English in Shanghai. She eventually returned to the United States, where she continued to mentor up-and-coming activists across movements. Vicki died in 2007 and continues to be remembered as a key mentor and leader in social movements across 3 different continents. During her memorial service, a pamphlet distributed to guests concluded with one of Vicki's calls to action. Of course, there will be twists and turns, but victory in the race belongs to the long-distance runners, not sprinters. Everywhere, the JUST slogan is reverberating. No justice, no peace. All month, we're talking about revolutionaries. For more information, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Womanica Podcast. Special thanks to co-creators Jenny and Liz Kaplan for having me as a guest host. Talk to you tomorrow.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, and Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and we're paying tribute to Vicki Garvin. She called herself an internationalist, and in 1957 she was in Nigeria, and she was getting ready to come back to Babylon, and she heard about what was taking place in Ghana with Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and she ended up going to live in Ghana. And at that particular time, I wanted to play some music that was popular at that particular time. Now, the biggest songs at that particular time were Miriam Makeba. Miriam Makeba was big, and Paul Anka was big. Now, Paul Anka is an interesting guy because Paul Anka was Lebanese. He has Lebanese roots, and he did a lot of work with a lot of black artists. But I guess Paul Anka's known big. He wrote the Johnny Carson theme. Johnny Carson, for the younger folks, had a national show, the evening show, 11 o'clock, I think. But he started the whole late night, one of the first people to start the late night situation. And Paul Anka wrote the theme song for that particular song. Paul Anka also wrote the song called My Way. I think that was done by Francis Albert Sinatra. But not Francis Albert Sinatra, but Paul Anka used to be, he was a child star. He was born in Ottawa, and he is of Lebanese. He has Lebanese roots. And a young man, no longer in the land of the living, by the name of Leonard Oscar Johnson, Lenny Johnson. He owned the Third World Bookstore here in Toronto. The Third World Bookstore is a bookstore that Quincy Jones did a lot of research, bought a lot of books from him for the film Roots. He did a lot of research from Lenny's bookstore, but Lenny used to take care of Paul Anka when Paul Anka was literally a kid. Leonard O. Johnson used to, he was a porter on the Canadian National, on the railroad, and his job was to basically look after Uhuru Sasa. I should say, I was getting ready to say Hotep, but I'm not a Hotepper. So you're listening to Diasporic Music, and we were listening to Paul Anka. And we are going to turn this over to Melinda Francis. So what's up now, Melinda?
So this is, International Women's Month. So we're going to listen to a piece around I.D.B. Wells. And I.D.B. Wells was a journalist. She was a civil rights activist, a women's rights activist. And she was basically born in Mississippi, Holy Springs, Mississippi, in July 16th, 1862. And she was a journalist of her time, and she was very instrumental of documenting lynchings, especially at her time in Memphis, Tennessee. And she basically was chased out of there and ended up going to Chicago, and where she spent the rest of her life, and she died in 1931. So, let's listen to a short piece around I.D.B. Wells.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. Today, we'll be discussing a hero of mine, somebody who used her writing, research, and unrelenting commitment to become one of the most important anti-lynching advocates in American history. We are talking about the one and the only Mrs. Ida B. Wells Barnett. Her anti-lynching campaign brought international attention to the omnipresent threat of violence plaguing Black Americans in the South and in other parts of the United States. Her career would also lead her to becoming one of the founding members of the National Association of Colored Women and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Her work was invaluable in the early struggle for Black American civil rights, and she helped lay the groundwork for generations of Black activists and journalists who would come after her. Let's start the show. I want to note up top that there will be mentions of physical and sexual violence in this episode. Wells was born enslaved in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Wells's father, James, was involved with the Freedmen's Aid Society and helped to establish a college for newly freed Black Americans in Holly Springs called Shaw University. Renamed West College in 1892, the school would join the ranks of a growing number of HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities, formed during this period. On a personal note, as the child and the grandchild and the nephew and the cousin and the husband of people who all went to HBCUs, I can't begin to express how important these schools have been to the Black community. Places that, for years, were the only institutions that Black people could count on for higher education. Given her father's work, Wells grew up around Black folks who were trying to build a better, more just society for her people. But after losing both of her parents and one of her siblings to yellow fever, she became the primary caregiver to her 5 brothers and sisters. Wells found herself taking care of her siblings while also working as a teacher and attending school at Rusk College. During this time, she discovered her passion for writing. In 1882, Wells moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where her career as a journalist would begin. She became co-owner of a local newspaper where she wrote passionate editorials and conducted in-depth investigative work to shine a light on the widespread acts of lynchings in the South. Lynching, or killing by way of mob without a trial, became a common form of retribution in the South as a means of administering vigilante justice absent of due process. These acts of violence took many forms, perhaps most infamously, hanging a person from a tree. These acts were designed to inspire fear and were used as an intimidation tactic against African Americans to assert social, political, and economic control. And unfortunately, Black Americans in the South had to live with the looming threat that such violence could happen to them or their family at any moment. It's important to remember also that this history wasn't that long ago. In my own book, How the Word is Passed, I describe how my own grandfather, born in 1930 Mississippi, told me a story of how, when he was a boy, a Black man in a small town of just 1,000 people was kidnapped by night riders, hung from a tree, and castrated. And this sort of thing was happening all across the South. Lynchings could, and often did, take place without the victim having been charged with any sort of crime. And even if someone had been charged with a crime, a vigilante mob kidnapping someone in the middle of the night and killing them is not justice, no matter what the accusation is. As you can imagine, people were scared. To speak out against lynching would put a target on your back. And what's remarkable about Ida B. Wells is that she knew this and did it anyway. And while Wells was brave, she was also strategic. Wells's editorials and investigative reporting angered many local whites. And while she wanted to make waves, she understood that to be effective, she needed to stay alive. So she published many articles in Black newspapers and periodicals under the moniker Iola. Lynching was not the only cause Ida B. Wells took a stand against. She also sued the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Company for discrimination. As the story goes, she purchased a first-class train ticket for a ride from Memphis to Woodstock, Tennessee. But the train crew ordered her to move to the car reserved for African Americans. But Wells did not leave the first-class car voluntarily. The conductor and some passengers forcibly removed her and then kicked her off the train. She won a $500 settlement in a circuit court case, but that decision was later overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court in 1887. Following this train situation, Wells became even more impassioned to combat discrimination against Black Americans in all areas. For example, while working as a journalist, Wells became a teacher at a segregated public school in Memphis, Tennessee. That first-hand experience led her to begin writing about educational inequality, and this time under her own name. As a result, in 1891, after publicly criticizing the lack of resources for Black-only schools in the area, she was fired. The following year, her efforts as a journalist refocused on the lynching problem in the South after she lost 3 of her friends. Calvin McDowell, Thomas Moss, and Will Stewart owned a store called the People's Grocery in Memphis. The presence of this moderately successful Black-owned business sparked anger and unrest among the local white community. On March 3, 1892, a group of white men, including a sheriff's deputy, went to the People's Grocery to confront McDowell, Moss, and Stewart. This led to an altercation, and by the time it was over, some of the white men had been injured. As a result, McDowell, Moss, and Stewart were arrested, and some Memphis newspapers referred to the men's efforts to defend themselves and their store as an armed rebellion by the Black men in Memphis. Just a few days later, at 2:30 in the morning, a mob of 75 masked men broke into the jail and kidnapped McDowell, Moss, and Stewart. They were brought to the edge of the town, and they were lynched. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Wells launched an extensive investigation on lynching and used her publications to openly denounce the practice. She traversed the southern states for 2 months to gather information on other acts of lynching. And in October of 1892, she published a pamphlet entitled Southern Horrors, which detailed all of her findings. Wells stayed in the North and never returned to Memphis, but that did not keep her from writing about the horrors of lynching in the South. Wells also took her research and anti-lynching campaign across the Atlantic, specifically to Great Britain in the 1890s. She helped establish the British Anti-Lynching Society in 1894, and her work on the transatlantic anti-lynching circuit demonstrates the ways African-American women activists internationalized social justice work. This built on the work of earlier abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown, who also traveled to England to promote the abolitionist cause. In 1895, Wells published The Red Record, which outlined the horrors of lynching to a Northern audience whom Wells did not think was fully aware of everything that was going on in the South, writing that thousands of Black people had been killed in cold blood without the formality of judicial trial and legal execution. She also used the pamphlet to challenge the rape myth that whites used to justify the lynching of African American men. See, a significant component of the culture of lynching was the idea of protecting white womanhood from Black men who were stereotyped as being over-sexualized and always waiting for their chance to sexually attack a white woman. Countless Black men were lynched after being wrongfully accused of raping, assaulting, eyeing, or even speaking to a white woman. Wells's research, however, revealed that many victims of lynchings had not committed any crimes at all, but had rather challenged white supremacy. Challenging white supremacy could include anything from being a Black person simply leading a successful life as a business owner to refusing to cross the street when passing a white person. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, more than 4,000 Black Americans were lynched in the South alone between 1877 and 1950. And this is only the numbers that we know. There's every reason to believe that the numbers could be even higher than that. Wells had completed much of her life's work before marrying in 1895 to an attorney and newspaper editor, Ferdinand L. Barnett. The couple would have 4 children. Still, even after starting a family, Wells believed that her work was not done. In 1896, Wells was among the founding members of the National Association of Colored Women. The founding convention was held in Washington, D.C., and other founding members included Harriet Tubman, Frances E.W. Harper, and Mary Church Terrell. And I don't know about y'all, but that's basically like the Avengers. And she kept going. In 1898, Wells took her anti-lynching campaign to the White House She led a protest in Washington, D.C., calling for President William McKinley to make reforms, and she called for President Woodrow Wilson to end discriminatory hiring practices in government jobs. And throughout the remainder of her life, she was incredibly active in the fight for women's suffrage. A determined woman in every respect, Ida B. Wells is one of America's greatest heroes. She had the determination and the bravery required to stand up against one of the darkest elements of America's past, and in many ways, helped lay the groundwork for both the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century and the Black Lives Matter movement of today. Her life's work was dedicated to stopping the unjust murderings of Black Americans in the South, a practice that, due to the widespread, profoundly entrenched influence of the Klan, was often protected by law enforcement and legal policies. Wells died of kidney disease on March 25, 1931, at the age of 68 in Chicago, Illinois. Her legacy is a remarkable one. She did so much for so many and used her gifts and determination to help build a better world. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is made possible with the help of all these nice people, and our animation team is Thought Cafe. Crash Course is a Complexly production, and if you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everybody, forever, you can support the series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content that you love. Thank you to all our patrons for making Crash Course possible with your continued support.